When I walked into the church that morning, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Conversations halted mid-sentence, eyes flickered nervously, and necks craned to catch a glimpse of me. Some gasped, while others whispered my name as if it were a curse. It had been over a decade since most of them had seen me, and now I stood at my ex-husband's funeral like an unexpected storm. Martin Devlin, the man I once called my husband, lay in an open casket adorned with white roses and soft music playing in the background. His second wife, Tina, sat front and center, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she hardly used. Beside her were my daughters, Jenna and Harper, both avoiding my gaze as if I were a ghost. I knew I wasn't welcome. This space had long ceased to be mine. But I didn't come for them or to create a scene. I came because, despite everything he had done, Martin had once been my entire world, and a part of me needed to see this through, to mark the end. As I walked slowly down the side aisle, whispers filled the air, fragments of conversation reaching my ears. Is that her, after all these years? Why would she even come? I didn't flinch. I held my head high, my back straight, and chose a pew near the back, quietly folding my coat beside me. It felt like I was on trial, but I wasn't ashamed. They didn't know the whole story, and most never would. The minister spoke, people cried, and memories I had buried rushed back. Our first Christmas, the house in Charleston, the girls learning to ride bikes, and the suffocating silence that marked our last. Years together, just when I thought the whispers might die down, a lawyer stood at the podium, a tall man in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand, his voice calm, yet clear. I've been asked to read a section of Martin Devlin's last will and testament, he announced. A tense pause filled the room as he flipped open the folder, cleared his throat, and read, "To Leona Markham." Heads turned in unison, every pair of eyes, including my daughters, locking onto me. Let me tell you the whole story, but first take a moment and subscribe to my channel. It really means a lot to me, thanks. Now, no one spoke, no one blinked. In that frozen moment, I realized the real story was only just beginning. Before betrayal turned my name into whispers, I was simply Leona, a wife, a mother, a woman who believed in building a life, not chasing one. Martin and I were married for 25 years, and for most of that time I thought we had something steady, something sacred. We met in our late 20s. I was an art student with paint on my hands and dreams in my pockets, while he was a freshly minted business graduate brimming with ambition. His world was filled with sharp corners and hard decisions, while mine was messy and vibrant. We balanced each other, or so I thought. We married in a modest ceremony on a spring afternoon in Charleston. The church was small, the cake was store-bought, but we laughed like children building castles in the sand. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment above a bookstore, where I painted while Martin built his financial consulting business from our kitchen table. We lived on ramen noodles and big dreams, always promising that one day things would be easier. And eventually, they were. Martin's business took off. Clients came, and so did the money. He wore suits that cost more than our rent in those early years. I stayed home raising our daughters, Jenna and Harper, while painting on the side, mostly as gifts, sometimes for neighbors and often just to remember who I was. Our home in Charleston was something I had helped design. The garden bloomed, with hydrangeas because I loved how wild they grew. The walls were painted in calming earth tones, and every corner held a piece of our life. Baby photos, handprint paintings, Martin's first business award, and the clay dog Harper made in 2nd grade. We weren't flashy. We were rooted. For years, my life revolved around my family. I drove the girls to school, made homemade lunches, and hosted PTA meetings. I taught them how to bake, how to apologize sincerely, and how to stand up for themselves. When Martin came home late, I made sure dinner was still warm. When he traveled, I tucked handwritten notes into his luggage. He didn't always notice, but I didn't do it for praise. I did it because I loved him. Looking back now, I see the quiet imbalance that had always existed between us. Martin was the face of our family's success, the one everyone saw and admired. I was the foundation, the unseen spine holding everything together. And I didn't mind. Not then. I wasn't hungry for recognition. I believed in partnership, not performance. As our daughters grew, so did Martin's business. We upgraded from a modest sedan to 2 luxury cars and traveled the world. Paris, Costa Rica, even a cruise to Alaska. From the outside, we appeared to be the perfect portrait of success. Neighbors envied us. Friends sought our advice. And I, in my quiet way, was proud of what we had built. But now, I wonder if I had mistaken comfort for connection. Martin had become more distant over time, and I filled those gaps with excuses and understanding. He's just stressed, I told myself. It's a busy season. Or, he's doing all this for us. I didn't want to admit what I already knew deep down. The man I married was slowly becoming someone I didn't recognize. And worse, someone who no longer saw me at all. There were no screaming matches, no slammed doors, just a creeping silence that settled between us like dust on shelves long forgotten. I'd ask about his day, and he'd respond with a distracted nod. I'd show him a new painting, and he'd glance at it briefly, say, "Nice," and return to his laptop. He wasn't cruel. He was absent, there in body, but somewhere else entirely in mind. And yet, even then, I didn't think we were broken. I convinced myself it was just a season, a dry spell that all marriages go through. I told myself love was sometimes quiet, that after so many years maybe comfort was enough. I clung to that belief like a lifeline, thinking we were safe, that we had weathered the hardest parts. I didn't realize that while I was tending to our life together, Martin was already halfway out the door. The first sign came not in the form of a fight or a slammed door, but on what was supposed to be a celebration. Martin was being honored with a leadership award at a gala downtown. A black tie affair with string quartets, hors d'oeuvres, and ice sculptures carved into company logos. I spent the entire afternoon preparing. I wore a midnight blue dress that he had once complimented years ago, paired with the silver necklace he gave me on our 20th anniversary. I even styled my hair the way he liked. Soft curls, not too much spray. I wanted to look elegant, not for anyone else, but for him. When we arrived, Martin immediately drifted away from me, absorbed in networking and handshakes. I told myself it made sense. It was his night, after all. I stood near the bar with a glass of white wine, watching him from afar as he laughed, clapped backs, and toasted with colleagues. He was magnetic in rooms like that, the kind of man everyone gravitated toward. I didn't mind being in the background, I never had. But then it happened. An executive from a partner firm approached to introduce himself to Martin, who was standing nearby with a few associates. I moved closer, smiling, ready to extend my hand. That's when Martin gestured toward me casually and said, "Oh, and that's Leona. She keeps me sane." He said it like a joke, with a chuckle that made the group laugh. I laughed too, though it didn't reach me. My hand, mid-gesture, floated awkwardly for a moment before I let it drop to my side. She keeps me sane, not my wife, not the woman who had stood beside him since day one, not even my better half, Just someone who kept him grounded, like a therapist or a houseplant. It was a passing remark in a crowded ballroom, but it landed in me like a stone. The rest of the evening I smiled through it all, clinking glasses, posing for photos, and applauding as Martin gave his acceptance speech. He thanked his team, his mentors, and even his late father. He never once mentioned me, I told myself. It wasn't personal, that he'd simply forgotten. Or maybe he thought mentioning me in a professional setting would seem out of place. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I felt the warmth leave my chest. On the drive home, I wanted to say something. Not to accuse, but to understand. At a red light, I turned to him and asked softly, "Did you mean what you said tonight? About me just keeping you sane?" He didn't even look up from his phone, scrolling through congratulatory texts, as he replied, "It was just a joke." Don't be so sensitive. That word, sensitive, had begun to follow me like an unwelcome shadow. Every time I tried to express something that hurt, something that made me feel invisible or dismissed, it became his shield, a way to deflect without engaging. And every time he said it, I felt myself shrink a little smaller inside. After the gala, the days became quiet, too quiet. He returned to his work, and I returned to the rhythm of home. Laundry, groceries, tidying up. But something had shifted. I stopped waiting at the window when he worked late. I stopped cooking elaborate dinners and asking about his day. Instead, I began noticing small changes. His new cologne, sharper clothes, and how his phone was never out of reach. He laughed more with clients than with me. I didn't accuse him of anything, convincing myself it was just a phase. But deep down, I knew I was no longer at the center of his world. Slowly, our home felt different, like a house settling unevenly. On the surface, things seemed the same. We shared a bed, kept our routines. But underneath, something essential had gone. Silent. Martin started coming home late, or not at all, blaming client dinners and meetings. I stopped asking for details, realizing I was no longer part of his world. One evening, for our 30th anniversary, I made his favorite dinner, lit candles, and waited. He never came home. No call, no text. He arrived the next morning with no apology, casually saying he crashed at a hotel. I wanted to scream, but instead I went to the kitchen and poured his coffee. It wasn't weakness, it was exhaustion. I was tired of chasing scraps of affection and having my pain dismissed. Slowly, cracks showed in other ways. At dinner, when Harper mentioned taking a gap year, I encouraged her. But Martin laughed, saying, "You see what happens when kids spend too much time with their mother?" Harper looked uncomfortable. Jenna chuckled. I stayed quiet. My daughters, once my joy, had grown closer to Martin, the fun parent. To them I was just moody, always tired. Martin spent weekends away for business, glued to his phone when home. My words bounced off him like dull noise. He forgot the little things, touching me in passing, saying goodnight or asking about the art classes I'd started teaching. Slowly, I realized I wasn't just losing him. I was losing myself. He never asked about me. Sometimes I'd cry into a towel in the bathroom, silently breaking down. Not because he yelled, he never raised his voice, but because he erased me so methodically I questioned if I'd ever truly been seen. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed in vows, because I hoped he'd come back to me. But love isn't something you carry alone, and I was already carrying everything. It all came to a head on a Sunday afternoon at a backyard brunch for Jenna's engagement. I had spent the week preparing, polishing silver, arranging flowers. and setting the table with care. Hosting had always brought me joy, not for the sake of hosting, but because small, thoughtful details made others feel celebrated. It was the kind of effort I once gave freely, even as my own world quietly fell apart. Martin hadn't offered to help, but I hadn't asked. By then, I no longer expected him to notice the effort I put into making things beautiful. He arrived, that morning freshly shaven, smiling as if he hadn't missed every other dinner that month. Jenna hugged him tightly, glowing with excitement, while Harper arrived quietly, always observing. I busied myself in the kitchen, laughing when prompted, and mingling as expected but avoiding Martin. By then, we had perfected the art of coexisting without connection. Toward the end of the afternoon, Daniel, Jenna's fiancé, gave a toast. "Thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Devlin for hosting this. You two are such an inspiring couple," he said. The room clapped, and I forced a smile, though a knot tightened in my stomach. Martin raised his glass and chuckled. Well, if Jenna turns out half as smart as her mother, and hopefully twice as sane, I'll consider that a win. The laughter was light, but it stung. Tina, his friend from work, chuckled awkwardly from behind him, wearing the same lipstick I used to wear. I froze. It wasn't the words that hurt the most. It was the ease with which he said them, reducing me to a caricature. I caught Harper's eye, but she looked away. Quietly, I excused myself and went upstairs, sitting at the edge of the bed, and staring at my reflection in the mirror. My lipstick had faded. I looked tired, older than I remembered. Downstairs, they laughed without me. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt something shift, cold and sharp, like the snap of a winter branch. Later that evening, I calmly asked Martin, "Why did you say that today in front of everyone?" Without looking up, he replied, "It was a joke, Leona. You need to stop taking everything so personally." That night, I slept in the guest room, telling him I had a headache. He didn't ask questions or check on me. He was already gone, just not officially. That moment, that small act of cruelty disguised as humor, became the turning point. The moment I realized the man I built a life with no longer respected me. It didn't end in a fight, but in silence. The day Martin suggested I leave was ordinary, in every other way. Folding laundry, I froze as he said casually, "I think it would be better for both of us if we had some space." My heart didn't break. It had already braced for this moment. "Space," I repeated. "You want me to move out?" He shrugged, detached. "It doesn't have to be dramatic. We're clearly in different places." He didn't admit to loving someone else, though I already knew. I had smelled her cheap vanilla perfume on his coat. There were no regrets, no anger, just cold efficiency, like ending a lease. I packed my things carefully, not in chaos, but with intention. I took photo albums, my mother's cookbook, and my art supplies. I left behind the wedding album, crystal, vases, and unused cookware. Jenna, ever loyal to her father, asked, "Are you sure this is the best thing, Mom? You always seemed frustrated." Frustrated, as if my grief was just a mood. Harper cried, saying she never saw it coming, convinced. It was just a rough patch. I didn't correct her. It wasn't her fault. Her father had always disguised absence as busyness. Within a week, I moved into a modest condo in Savannah. It was nothing like the Charleston home. Smaller, quieter, with outdated carpet and peeling wallpaper. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, the silence didn't feel heavy. It was clean, untouched, full of possibility. Some days I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, wondering what all those years had meant. Had I wasted my best years loving someone who never truly loved me back? Had I stayed too long out of duty, fear, or hope that the man I married would return. Some days these questions haunted me, but other days, beneath the grief, I felt something stirring. Not joy, but space. Space to breathe, to think, to remember who I had been before. My life became an extension of someone else's ambition. I didn't share what had happened with many people. Not out of shame, but because I didn't feel the need to explain my choices to those who never asked about my pain. Let them think I walked away on a whim, that I was too sensitive or complicated. The truth was simple. I left because staying had become another way of disappearing. Rock bottom wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. A lonely grocery aisle, a cold kitchen with one coffee mug, a voicemail unanswered. And yet, in that stillness, there was the faintest glimmer of something else, the chance to start again. I moved into a small condo in Savannah, its radiator clanging loudly at night, with only a few framed photos, second-hand furniture, and thrifted ceramic birds to fill the empty shelves. But no decoration could fill the space between my ribs. Waking up was the hardest part. For a moment, I'd forget I was alone, reaching across the bed to touch the cool, empty sheets where Martin used to be. Even his absence carried weight. Calls from the girls came occasionally. Jenna's brief and obligatory. Harper's softer but infrequent. "Just wanted to check in, Mom," they'd say. And I'd lie, pretending I was fine and painting again, though none of that was true yet. I found part-time work as a receptionist at a dental clinic downtown. The pay wasn't great, but it kept me afloat. The other women were polite, but I didn't make friends. Grief weighed on me like an invisible backpack, making me feel older than my years. Nights were the hardest, falling asleep to reruns just to avoid the empty bedroom, flipping through old albums of Christmas mornings, school plays, and a honeymoon where Martin and I had once looked happy. Maybe we were, or maybe I just didn't know better. The hardest day came when I stumbled across a photo of Martin online. He stood beside Tina, arm around her, both of them smiling like a polished political couple. Jenna and Harper were in the photo too. Their new family, complete us without me. It felt like being erased in real time. I barely made it to the clinic bathroom before breaking down, weeping into my sleeves. I wasn't crying because I missed Martin. I was crying because no one else seemed to miss me. I had built my life around others, and when I stopped, I simply disappeared. I wish I could say that moment brought clarity, but it didn't. Instead, I went home, curled up under a thrifted quilt and whispered, "You're still here," over and over as though reminding myself I hadn't died with my marriage. Rock bottom wasn't a bang, but a low echo that made me question if I had ever truly existed outside of what I gave to others. Sometimes, though, when you're buried that deep, you start to feel the ground under your feet again. That was the beginning of stillness. And in stillness, things begin to grow. It happened on a Tuesday, an unremarkable day. I had taken the afternoon off to sort through old boxes cluttering the condo's storage closet. The labels were faded. Kitchen photos, Leona's studio, and one that simply said, Ray. My brother Ray had passed away the year before. He was the only family member who truly checked in on me during the divorce, while others politely avoided the subject. Ray asked real questions and listened without judgment. When Martin left, Ray had shown up with groceries, wine, and a single sentence that stayed with me. "You were always more than just his wife." I pulled down the box labeled Ray and carried it to the dining table, trembling as I opened it. Inside were pieces of his life, tools, flannel shirts, sketches of a woodworking project he never finished. At the bottom, I found a yellow envelope, slightly bent, with my name scrawled across it in his handwriting. Leona. Read when you're ready. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside was a short note from Ray and a folded, creased piece of paper. I read Ray's note first. Sis, I found this while cleaning out the house after your divorce. I wasn't sure when to give it to you. You looked so broken then. I didn't want to make it worse, but I also knew this wasn't mine to keep. You deserve the truth. Ray. The second sheet was a letter from Martin. It wasn't addressed or stamped, likely never meant to be sent. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained sharp. Leona, if you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to say it out loud. I've done a lot of things I can't take back. But leaving you the way I did is the one thing that keeps me awake at night. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I hated the man I had become. And you reminded me of who I used to be. You never asked for anything, and still, I made you carry everything. You gave me a home, 2 beautiful daughters, and a life I didn't deserve. And I repaid you with silence, with absence, with shame. Tina didn't save me. She just didn't know me well enough to see how far I had fallen. You did, and that scared me. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know that you were never the problem. You were always the best part of my life. I sat in stunned silence, the letter resting on the table like a confession from a ghost. My eyes welled with tears, but I didn't cry. I stared out the window at the gray sky, watching the wind bend the trees. For so long, I had believed I was invisible, disposable, the one left behind because I wasn't enough. But here, in his own words, was proof. It wasn't me. It had never been me. Somewhere deep in my chest, something cracked open. For so long, I believed I was invisible, the woman left behind because I wasn't enough. But here it was in Martin's own words. It wasn't me. It had never been me. I held the letter like a fragile artifact from another life. It didn't change the past, nor erase the scars, but it shaped a truth I could carry forward, one untainted by gaslighting or mockery. I framed the letter and placed it on my bookshelf, marking a turning point. This is where the story begins to change. That night, I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years. Not to impress anyone, but to feel something that was mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was becoming someone again. Something shifted after finding that letter. It didn't happen all at once. I didn't wake up with newfound purpose. But slowly, the fog that had wrapped around my life began to lift. I started waking up earlier, not out of necessity, but to enjoy the morning stillness. I opened the windows, breathed in the salty air and listened. To the birds, the traffic, to myself. The silence that once haunted me became space for growth, for reclaiming the parts of me buried beneath years of being his wife and their mother. That framed letter served as a reminder. My worth had never been imagined. It was always there. Now that I had proof my love hadn't been foolish, something inside me hardened. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. I began journaling again, writing about my childhood, my marriage, and the joy I had once claimed. Slowly, I remembered who I was, not just someone who loved and lost, but someone who survived. I stopped coloring my hair, an act of liberation. For decades, I had erased the gray to chase youth for a man who was now gone. Letting my silver show made me feel real, honest, and unhidden. On weekends, I returned to the community art studio where I had once volunteered. The scent of paint and clay nearly brought me to tears, reminding me how much I missed the messiness of creation. I started teaching a small watercolor class for women over 50 who came to feel seen. Together we shared laughter and stories, and I remembered what belonging felt like. I also learned to say no to Jenna when she called, asking me to visit, while Tina would be there, to Harper when she tried to play peacekeeper, and to friends who only wanted gossip, not the truth. Boundaries became my armor, and I decided who could enter my life. I wasn't angry anymore. I was blooming with a new kind of power, one born from survival and self-discovery. One morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I said aloud, "You're still here." For the first time, I believed it. I wasn't defined by Martin or what he hadn't given me. I was Leona Markham, 62 years old, silver-haired, paint-stained, unbroken, and I was just getting started. After that awakening came stillness, not the lonely kind from months before, but focused and intentional. I didn't share what I found in Martin's letter with anyone. It was mine alone, and I didn't want to diminish its significance. Instead, I began planning, not for revenge or validation, but for ownership of my life and what I was ready to reclaim. It began with paperwork. I pulled out old folders and reviewed legal and financial documents I had previously avoided. Bank accounts, insurance policies, joint assets. This time, I tackled them like a woman holding a flashlight in a dark tunnel. I wasn't afraid anymore. I reached out to Dean Holloway, an old friend of Ray's, who was a retired estate lawyer and had once fished with my brother. Dean greeted me warmly, reminiscing about how Ray always said I had more grit than anyone he knew. I smiled, thinking of how Ray had called me strong even when I didn't believe it. Dean helped me quietly review Martin's estate, uncovering sealed documents tied to last-minute changes Martin made before his death. Tina had contested them, but certain provisions were protected. Martin had created a trust in my name under a discreet legal entity just 6 months before he passed. When I asked why, Dean paused and said, "I think he was trying to do right by you in the only way he knew how. Quietly, and a little too late." It didn't erase the past, but it gave me leverage, not over others, but over myself. Financially and emotionally, I now had the means to rebuild. I used the funds to move into a slightly larger apartment. Still modest, still mine, and it was enough to remind me that my story wasn't over. I donated half of my old clothes, sold Martin's jewelry, and kept only my wedding band, tucking it away with Ray's letter and Martin's confession as a time capsule of closure. Each morning I walked before sunrise, savoring the untouched quiet. During those walks I made decisions, to leave the past behind, to stop chasing one-sided relationships, and to build a new life. I enrolled in a community leadership course, something I'd wanted to do when the girls were young, but that Martin had dismissed as a waste of time. When I introduced myself, I didn't mention being a divorcee, a mother, or a widow. I simply said, "I'm Leona. I teach art. I'm learning how to rebuild." It felt true. I didn't share my progress on social media, update the girls on every change, or reach out to Tina or Martin's friends. I let the silence speak. Healing doesn't require announcements. It's the small, deliberate steps no one sees coming. By the time Martin's estate was settled, I had made peace with the fact that I didn't need anything from him. And yet, I knew what came next would surprise everyone who had written me off. From the outside, I was still Leona Markham, the quiet ex-wife who had disappeared after the divorce. I hadn't made a scene or demanded attention. To most, I was invisible, and they were comfortable with that. But their comfort began to crack. Thomas Greer, Martin's longtime attorney, reached out explaining that I was legally required to attend the will reading due to complex trust accounts in my name. What Thomas didn't know was that I already knew about the contents. Dean had reviewed the paperwork with me weeks earlier. I knew about the Charleston house, the art fund Martin had named after me, and the explicit instructions ensuring these assets couldn't be overridden by Tina or the girls. None of them knew. That was the shift. Not a fight for power, but quiet knowledge. I didn't need to argue. Truth and time were on my side. The first sign of this shift came from Jenna, who called hesitantly one evening. "Hey, Mom. I heard from Dad's lawyer that you're going to the will reading." Her tone carried confusion. The cracks in the narrative Tina and Martin had fed her were starting to show. "Yes, I'll be there," I replied. After a long pause, she admitted, "I wasn't expecting that." I answered simply, "I wasn't expecting a lot of things, Jenna." The second sign came from Tina, who sent me a handwritten letter. It was defensive and polite on the surface, but the anxiety beneath was clear. "Leona, I hope we can all behave appropriately at the reading and avoid unnecessary tension." She was scrambling, grasping for control over something already lost. The will reading. Thomas read Martin's statement aloud. "Tina, you gave me companionship in my later years, and for that, I'm grateful. But Leona gave me everything else. She built the foundation of the life I lived, even when I didn't deserve her love or loyalty. What I leave to her is not a gift or favor. It's recognition of what was always hers, a debt I can never fully repay." The room fell silent. Tina's composure cracked. Jenna stared down, tense, while Harper looked at me for the first time. In years, Thomas concluded the reading, but Tina's voice cut through, sharp and brittle. "This is outrageous. Martin wouldn't have done this." Her words faltered as she searched for validation but found none. Thomas calmly replied, "The documents are legally binding and notarized. There is nothing more to contest." Jenna glanced at me, her expression a mix of confusion and something unspoken. Harper, however, met my gaze fully, her eyes filled with something that looked like clarity. I didn't gloat or smirk. This moment wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked open. For so long, I had believed I was the invisible one, the woman left behind because I wasn't enough. But in Martin's words, I found the truth. It wasn't me. It had never been me. I held the letter like a fragile artifact from another life. It didn't change the past or erase the scars, but it shaped a truth I could carry forward, one free from gaslighting and silence. I framed the letter and placed it on my bookshelf, marking a turning point. This is where the story begins to change. That night, I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years, not to impress anyone, but to feel something that was mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was becoming someone again. After finding that letter, something shifted within me. I didn't wake up with newfound purpose immediately, but piece by piece, the fog around my life began to lift. I started waking up earlier, not out of obligation, but to enjoy the morning stillness. I opened the windows, breathed in the salty air and listened to the birds, the traffic, to myself. The silence that once haunted me became space for growth and for reclaiming the parts of me, buried beneath years of being his wife and their mother. That framed letter became a reminder that my worth had always been there. Now that I had proof my love hadn't been wasted, I felt something inside me harden, not with bitterness, but with resolve. I began journaling again, writing about my childhood, my marriage, and the joy I had once claimed. Slowly I remembered who I was, not just someone who loved and lost, but someone who survived. I stopped coloring my hair, an act of liberation, letting my silver grow in. It didn't make me look older. It made me look real and unhidden. On weekends, I returned to the community art studio where I had once volunteered. The scent of paint and clay almost brought me to tears, reminding me of how much I missed creating without the pressure of perfection. I started teaching a small watercolor class for women over 50, who came not to become great artists, but to feel seen. Together we shared laughter and stories, and I remembered what belonging felt like. I also learned to say no. To Jenna when she called asking to visit while Tina would be there. To Harper when she urged me to be more civil about their father. And to friends who wanted gossip instead of the truth. Boundaries became my armor, allowing me to control who entered my life. I wasn't angry anymore. I was blooming with a deeper kind of power. One born from survival. One morning, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, I said aloud, "You're still here." For the first time, I believed it. I wasn't defined by what Martin gave or didn't give. I was Leona Markham, 62 years old, silver-haired, paint-stained, unbroken, and I was just getting started. After that awakening came stillness, not the lonely kind from months before, but focused and intentional. I didn't share what I found in Martin's letter with anyone. It was mine alone. Instead, I began planning, not for revenge or validation, but for ownership of my life. I pulled out old folders and reviewed legal and financial documents I had avoided. Bank accounts, insurance policies, joint assets. This time, I tackled them with determination. I reached out to Dean Holloway, an old friend of Ray's who was a retired estate lawyer. Dean remembered me instantly and helped me review what remained of Martin's estate. To my surprise, there were sealed documents still in limbo due to last-minute changes Martin made to his will. Tina had contested them, but certain provisions were protected. Martin had created a trust in my name. "Why would he do that?" I asked. Dean paused, then said, "I think he was trying to do right by you, quietly and a little too late." It didn't erase the past, but it gave me leverage. Not over others, but over myself, financially and emotionally. I now had the means to rebuild. As I prepared to settle into my new life, I donated half of my old clothes, sold Martin's jewelry, and kept only my wedding band, placing it in a small wooden box with Ray's letter and Martin's confession, a time capsule of closure. Every morning I took long walks before sunrise, enjoying the untouched quiet and making decisions to leave the past behind and build something new. I enrolled in a community leadership course, finally introducing myself as Leona. I teach art. I'm learning how to rebuild. By the time Martin's estate was settled and the will reading scheduled, I had already accepted that I didn't need anything from him. Yet I knew what came next would surprise everyone who had overlooked me. From the outside, I was still Leona Markham, the quiet ex-wife who had disappeared after the divorce. But slowly, their comfort began to crack. Thomas Greer, Martin's attorney, reached out explaining I was legally required to attend the reading due to complex trust accounts in my name. What he didn't know was that I had already reviewed the trust's contents with Dean. I knew about the Charleston house, the sizable art fund named after me, and the provisions ensuring they wouldn't override my rights. None of them knew, and that was the shift. I didn't need to argue. I had truth and time on my side. The first sign of change came from Jenna, who called hesitantly. "Hey, Mom. I heard from Dad's lawyer that you're going to the will reading." Her tone revealed confusion. "Yes, I'll be there," I replied. A long pause followed. "Okay. I just wasn't expecting that." It wasn't spite. It was just true. The next shift came with Tina's handwritten letter. It was brief and defensive, expressing her hope that we could all behave appropriately. At the reading, I found it amusing. She was scrambling to assert control over something she had lost. At the reading, Thomas read Martin's statement, recognizing my contributions to his life and acknowledging that what he left me was not a gift, but a recognition of what had always been mine. Silence enveloped the room, and the tension was palpable. Tina's expression hardened, and Jenna's face reflected confusion, while Harper looked at me for the first time in years. Thomas concluded the statement, and Tina cried out, "This is outrageous! He wouldn't just leave me out like this." Her words faltered, searching for validation. Thomas replied firmly that the documentation was clear and legally binding. Jenna looked up at me, her expression filled with uncertainty, while Harper met my gaze fully. I didn't gloat or smirk. This moment was for me, not them. A few weeks after the court ruling, I stood barefoot in the Charleston garden, pruning the hydrangeas I had planted 20 years ago. They were stubborn, wilted, but not dead, much like me. With care and attention, even the most forgotten things can bloom again. That's when I heard a car door close. Harper hadn't called or texted. She just showed up, parking in the driveway like she used to after school when she had something too big to say over the phone. Wiping my hands on my apron, I opened the side gate and saw her standing there, arms crossed, looking uncertain. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, my voice steady. I didn't rush to her. I waited. "I was hoping we could talk," she continued. "I know I should have come sooner." I nodded and motioned toward the porch. "Let's sit." We settled onto the old wicker bench Martin and I had picked out years ago. Harper looked tired, her makeup minimal, her eyes unsure. So much like her father's. But today they were searching, not certain. "I didn't know everything, Mom," she began, her voice cracking. "Not about the will, or what Dad left, you, or how things really ended." "I know," I said gently. "You weren't supposed to." She stared at me, startled. "What do you mean?" I explained. "You were a child. Even when you thought you understood, you were being fed a version of the truth by people who needed to protect their side of it." She lowered her eyes and whispered, "I believed him. I believed Tina. I thought you gave up." That stung, but I let it pass. I'd made peace with the fact that, to accept Tina, they had to rewrite me as disposable. It wasn't personal. It was survival. Harper hesitated before asking, "Why didn't you ever tell us your side?" I looked at the hydrangeas swaying in the breeze. "Because you wouldn't have heard me then. And I didn't want to turn you into weapons. I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for not asking, for not being there when you needed me." I placed my hand over hers. "I needed to be there for myself first," I said. "And I was. That's why I'm still standing." She laughed softly through her tears. "You're more than standing. You're thriving." I smiled but didn't reply. Her being here was enough. We talked for hours, the silence between us no longer heavy. Harper shared stories of her job, her apartment, and a relationship she wasn't sure about. I listened. Not as someone desperate to be included, but as someone comfortable in her own skin. Before she left, she asked, "Can I come by again? Maybe even paint with you?" "Of course," I said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But this time, I'll let you do the talking." She smiled. Deal. It wasn't a fairy tale reunion. No sweeping embraces or picture-perfect moments. But it was real, and that was enough. As she drove away, I stood in the doorway and realized something profound. I no longer needed my daughters to understand my story to feel whole. They were welcome in my life, but I didn't need their approval to live it. One Sunday morning, I finally allowed myself to be still. Not out of exhaustion, but out of peace. Real peace. I sat in the reading room I'd created in the Charleston house, the walls painted soft sage green, a few watercolors hanging above a cozy armchair. A record played faint jazz in the background, and on my lap was a cup of black tea. On the side table sat 3 things: Martin's framed letter, a photo of Ray holding a fish he'd exaggerated the size of, and a leather-bound journal filled with reflections from this strange, painful, and liberating chapter of my life. Healing doesn't erase scars. I still remember Martin's dismissive tone, the ache of being forgotten by my children, and the crushing silence of that first night in Savannah. But those memories feel distant now, like old photographs that no longer hurt. I had entered the Charleston house years ago as a wife trying to save a family, and left it stripped down to survival. Now, I returned not to reclaim what was lost, but to honor the woman who made it through. There was no revenge in my heart, no bitterness, just gratitude for the truth, even if it came late. Martin's last gesture wasn't redemption, it was confession, and that confession gave me back the space I had been denied. I used part of the inheritance to launch the Ray Markham Scholarship for creative women over 50. The rest I used to build a life that wasn't flashy, but full. I taught art at the community center, hosted workshops in the Charleston house, and helped women turn pain into pigment. Jenna hadn't called, but I no longer carried that burden. Harper visited often, and her presence was enough. One evening, after class, I stayed, behind in the studio. The golden light bathed the room as I stood before a blank canvas, the kind that used to intimidate me, but now excited me. I dipped my brush into cerulean blue and painted bold, unapologetic strokes. It wasn't for display or anyone's approval. It was for me. The woman who gave everything and asked for nothing, who was left behind and built a life from what remained. Stepping back from the canvas, I realized something profound. You don't need justice to heal. You just need to remember who you are.